In this video, I'm going to show you how to deploy LangGraph on Google Cloud Platform. So I tried to deploy this LangGraph application to LangGraph Platform, and I faced a few issues. I couldn't do it without having a LangSmith paid account. So I'll go over the issues that I faced in case you have the same issues. But if you already got your LangGraph application to work locally, and you just want to skip right ahead to deploying onto Google Cloud, then skip to the timestamp shown here. I looked at the deployment options and they offer four for deploying with LangGraph Platform. The first one is Self-Hosted Lite. And so I thought that Self-Hosted Lite meant that I could basically deploy LangGraph on my own platform. But if I look at what they describe, it's a self-deployment option that's limited to 1 million nodes per year. And it's a limited version of LangGraph Platform that you can run locally or in a self-hosted manner. So I proceeded with this route thinking that this would be the option if I wanted to deploy on Google Cloud Platform. It even says right here that the self-hosted Lite deployment is for you managing your infrastructure and you setting up the databases for Postgres and Redis. So I was following these instructions and then I went to self-hosted deployment how-to guide. I assumed they would give me instructions on how to basically deploy my LangGraph application. And then these instructions, it tells you, okay, you need to set up Postgres and Redis on your own infrastructure. So for me, that would be GCP. And then I need to create the Docker image of the LangGraph server using the LangGraph command line interface. And then I can deploy that Docker image by passing in the environment variables for these instances. And here it's just showing me the environment variables that I'm going to need. So the endpoint for the Redis instance, the endpoint for the Postgres instance, or whatever other database you might be using. And then you're going to need the LangSmith API key. This is if you're doing the self-hosted Lite, which is what we're doing. So assuming you have a LangSmith account, you just request the API key there. There's lots of documentation on how to do that. And first you need to build out the Docker image of the LangGraph application. So you need to install the command line interface of LangGraph. And then you can build the image using LangGraph build. Instead of using Docker build, then you use that. And then you can run the application once you have your database up and your Redis instance up, then you can just add the endpoints there. So this is one way to run your application, right? Another way would be to have the Docker compose file. And here you can see that you're starting up 3 different services, the Redis instance, Postgres, and the LangGraph server itself, the LangGraph API. And this is just a sample. This is just to get it running locally, obviously, because you're creating a database and the user and password, they're all the same value. And this would be the easiest way to get a local instance running, because then once you have these 3 services defined in this Docker compose file, then you can just run Docker compose up, and then that'll launch these 3 different services, and they're already connected just based on how this file is configured. You have your Redis environment variable just pointing to your Redis instance up here by name. You can see that, and then the port that it's running on. And then you have your LangSmith API key. That's if you're running self-hosted Lite, which is what we're doing. And then your Postgres is just pointing to your local instance here, your service that you started up here. So so far, this is where I was, and I was assuming that this would continue to explain how to deploy onto LangGraph Platform, but it just stops here, and then it tells you if you wanted to test that it's running, then just run this command and you'll get this response, and that confirms that it's running correctly. But then there's no explanation for how to get it running in the cloud or even in LangGraph Platform. So then I find this page here. It talks about the LangGraph Platform plans, and I'm still trying to deploy my application to the LangGraph Platform for free because right now I'm just testing and I want to have it deployed before I deploy it to production. I want to make sure that I've built something, and it's running successfully before I start paying for a service. And that's what I'm hoping to find here by going into the developer plan, which according to this is free for all LangSmith users. and it gives you access to the Self-Hosted Lite deployment option. And then here's just a comparison of what you get for these different options. Plus, the Plus plan is one that you pay for. I think it's $39, so like $40 a month. And I don't want to pay while I'm still in development, right? So I'm looking through this page and I find the LangSmith plans. And then the LangSmith plans tell me that the developer plan is free and I've already signed up. So now I just need to figure out how I can deploy onto Self-Hosted Lite. And then the last thing that I found for deploying onto LangGraph Platform was a how-to guide that I can't find anymore right now, but it basically said to go to LangSmith and then go to the left-hand side here, LangGraph Platform, and then you should see something here on the top right. You might not be able to see it with me in the way. There should be a button up here to deploy to LangGraph Platform. And I don't see that button, but I do see this message saying all LangSmith users on Plus, Premier, Startup, or Enterprise plans can now access LangGraph Platform for free in its beta. And since I'm on the developer plan, then I guess I don't have access to this. So I need a paid plan to LangSmith in order to deploy for free on LangGraph Platform. Anyways, none of this really made sense. If you're logged into your LangSmith account, you should be able to see here on the top right, it'll say the plan that you're on. And for me, it's just the developer. So I guess there's no way to deploy onto LangGraph Platform unless you're paying for LangSmith. And that's why I put together this video and this README file to describe how you can deploy your LangGraph application to Google Cloud Platform, where all of your services are going to be running on Google Cloud. It'll be your Redis, your Postgres, and your LangGraph application are all entirely running on Google Cloud. I put together this project where you can find it in the description. It's on my GitHub, but it's under the LangGraph task agent, and it's just a simple task agent app that they discussed in the LangGraph. It's the Introduction to LangGraph course in the LangChain Academy in Module 6. They show you how to deploy this application locally. So it's just a Task Maestro application that they built there. I just made a few minor changes. If we look at the Task Maestro, I just made it so that it's using Postgres as the checkpointer right here. It's using Postgres instead of saving everything in memory. So I just created this connection pool, and then it defines the checkpointer as the Postgres, and then I pass in the checkpointer to my graph right here during the compile step. That's really the only change that I made. There's a few changes to the file structure. So when you are, I'm assuming you're already familiar with how LangGraph, you're supposed to structure your application, but it's really important that you have in your LangGraph JSON file that this is correct. You know, it's pointing to the right path to wherever you have your graph, and then define the graph variable here, and then wherever that graph is defined, make sure you have the right path to that file, and then make sure you're defining where you can access that file, where your agents can be accessible, and all of your other dependencies. And then if you have an environment variable file, then just define it here. Okay, so before we deploy onto Google Cloud, we want to make sure that our application is running locally. So I'm just going to cover really quickly the steps if you just downloaded a LangGraph repo and you're trying to get this to work locally. So first you need to install the LangGraph command line interface with this command. And if you're following along with this video by forking the repo that I put together for this, then just follow these instructions. First you need to create a virtual environment with this command, and then you can activate it, and then you install your requirements that are found in this path. You install them to that virtual environment that you just created. Once you have your requirements installed, I'm not going to do them because I already have my project defined here. I already have my virtual environment, and then I have my environment variables here, and then my requirements are found in this path. When you do run this step right here, make sure you're in the right directory. So if you've forked this repo, then you're going to be in the root directory, which is just the YouTube. But you want to change directories into the projects LangGraph task agent. And then once you're there, then you can run these commands. So now that you have your dependencies installed, the next thing would be to deploy your Redis and Postgres instance. And I didn't really change much in that file. I got rid of, so if you're just using the task Maestro, or if you're familiar with it, they provided you with a Docker Compose file that has the 3 services, the Redis, Postgres, and then the LangGraph application all in one. And all you would have to do would be run Docker Compose up, and that would get your entire application running, including the Redis and the Postgres instances. But I made a change in mine where I removed the LangGraph server from the service because I want to show you how to launch that separately. So here I just have my Redis and my Postgres instances, and I made some changes to how I define them. But I created a network, basically, where the Redis and Postgres are going to be running in this network I just defined down here. And the reason I did it this way, and I removed the LangGraph server, is because I wanted to simulate deploying your services, on Google Cloud separately from your LangGraph application. So when you run Docker Compose up on this file, and remember, you have to be in the right directory to run this from, because otherwise it's not going to recognize that you're referring to this Docker Compose file that's in this directory. But when you run Docker Compose, I'll just run it. Docker Compose up. That's just going to start up your services here, which is just the service for Redis and Postgres. So we're just going to wait for that to finish. Okay, it looks like it finished building, and it created a container for my Redis and my Postgres. And then my network here, notice the name difference. It's using the name of the project followed by however I defined it here. So just make a note of that, because it'll be useful later. So I just want to check that these are running. I can see that that Docker Compose file created 2 images, one for Redis, one for Postgres, and they're both running. And now I can see that they're both accepting connections. The Redis is ready to accept connections, and the Postgres is also ready to accept connections. Okay, great. So far, so good. Now, the next step would be to build the application. And for that, I use the LangGraph build -t. I tag my LangGraph image with this name right here. So this is different than using Docker build. This is using the LangGraph command line interface library. And basically what it's doing is replacing Docker, and it's doing a few more things. And you can see what it's doing by, let me just start up a new terminal. If you do LangGraph Docker file, and then you can provide it with a config file and just give it the path to your LangGraph JSON file. If that's the format that you have it in, you can have it as a YAML file as well. But mine, I'm currently in the directory where mine is. Actually, I'm not. So let me just change directories really quickly, because I have to be in. Actually, I'll show you how this works. So my config file is available at this path because I'm running from the root of the repo. Then I just have to define it this way so that I can find it. And then lastly, I want to name my file just Docker file. So if I run this, then you can see basically it created a Docker file. And this is basically what LangGraph is going to be running. So by using the LangGraph command line interface to build the image, it's doing all of this in the background. And then this Docker file is ultimately what's going to be running. I just wanted to show you what the Docker file itself looks like. And that's basically what this command is doing. Okay, so now that we have our Docker image, basically, then we can run it. And you can run it by this command. This is the same command that we saw in the how-to guide for hosting your LangGraph application. That's this command right here. The differences are that I need to define a network, because remember when I ran my instances, then they're running on a specific network. Right here, I defined it as just my network. But then when it's actually being created, it has this name here that it's got a prefix of my project name. And then I have to give it the path to my environment file. And then I'm just mapping from 1000, which is where the LangGraph application by default runs it on port 8000, and I'm just mapping it to port 8123 on my machine, so that when if I want to access this app, I just go to localhost 8123, and then I'll be able to access the application. And then for the database URI, I'm just defining the path based on how I define the Postgres instance here with the username user, password pass, and database name MyDB. And then the container name, so the Docker container name for this service is my_Postgres, and so that's why I have it's hosted at my Postgres. So it's using the container name there, and then the port is 5432 as I defined it here. And then here's the database name, username, and password, and that's the PostgreSQL instance. And then for Redis, it's very similar, just Redis, and then the name of the container for your Redis, and the port that it's running on. And it's 6379 for Redis by default. And then your image name. Make sure that this is the same image name that you used up here. If I were to run this command from right here, it's not going to work because I'm in the YouTube project directory. I just have to make sure that whenever I'm running these commands that I'm in the right directory. So go to projects / LangGraph task agent, and then from there I can run this command. Actually, before I run this command, I need to make sure I didn't run this build. I need to build my image, make sure that I'm in this project directory. I'm going to build that LangGraph server image. Okay, just finished building, so now I can run the image. I just paste this command in here. Okay, it looks like it's running successfully, and I should be able to access my application. So this is running locally, so I should be able to access it at this endpoint, and it is running. I can see that I'm at localhost 81, and this is the API documentation, so I can interact with my graph. And then if I want to interact with my graph through LangGraph Studio, then I'll just follow this link right here. It's just using LangSmith endpoints, and then you're just passing in the URL to wherever you're running from. So mine is localhost, so here I just have at endpoint 127.001, and then the port number. If I open that, you can see that this is my Task Maestro application running successfully locally, and I can message it. I send it a message, and it looks like the AI that I'm using, which is OpenAI, is responding correctly. Okay, so we got it running locally, and that's one requirement we needed to confirm before we move on to deploying this application in the cloud. You want to make sure that your application is running locally, you don't have any issues, because once you deploy it, you will have a hard time trying to figure out what could be the issue, because it could be your deployment or it could be your application. But as long as it's running locally, then we've gotten that out of the way. So the next step would be to deploy the application into LangGraph Platform. But as I already showed, you can't do that without having a paid plan. So if you don't want to pay for the LangGraph Platform, it looks like you need a LangSmith account, which for the Plus plan, I think it was $39 for LangSmith. So if you don't want to pay that, then you can deploy it onto Google Cloud Platform. But these instructions right here, I included it just in case you wanted to try to follow along, but I already discussed it in the beginning of this video. The how-to guide for deploying onto LangGraph Platform, it doesn't seem complete because it doesn't actually show you how to do it for free. But this guide is what I've already showed you. Okay, finally, we're ready to deploy onto Google Cloud Platform. There's a lot of steps involved, and that's why I created this README file, because there's a lot of things that you need to do in order to get it to work. So hopefully this video and this README file helps you along the way. So the first thing we need to do is create a virtual private cloud within Google Cloud Platform, because you need a private network. That's what this is. You need a private network in order for all these services to communicate with each other. So Postgres, Redis, and your LangGraph application need to be in this private network in order to communicate with each other, because you can't expose your Postgres instance to the public internet without accessing it from a private network. I'm sure there's a way to do it with Google Cloud, but This is the most secure way. They don't recommend not accessing that Postgres instance from that private network. And this part's optional because you are going to be deploying your Redis and your Postgres instances on a private network. You're not going to be able to ping them from your local machine. You need to be within that network in order to communicate with them. And if you wanted to be able to do that from your local machine, then what you would do is you create a virtual machine in Google Cloud. You connect it to that private network that you've created, and then you can SSH tunnel into that virtual machine, basically connect to that virtual machine through SSH. And then from there, you're within the private network, so then you can ping your Redis and Postgres instances. And that's just optional. That's just if you want to be able to test your connections to these services. In case you have any issues with your application communicating with these services and you're trying to troubleshoot what the issue could be, then you could go into that network through this virtual machine so that you can see if you're able to communicate with those services in that way. Okay, so let's go into Google Cloud Platform and start creating all these services that we're going to need. So I'm within the Google Cloud Platform, and I'm going to create a project just so that at the end of this video, I can just delete the project and any billing associated with it, because all these services are going to charge you, and I just want to be able to delete all of them together. So I want to create a project. I just go to select project, new project, and then here I name it. I'm just going to name it the same that I have for my project in my repo. Okay, the rest looks good, so I'm going to create. Okay, so it's created my project. Here it is. And then now I want to create a virtual, I want to create a virtual private cloud. It looks like I need to enable the Compute Engine API before I can do that. So I'm just going to enable it. Okay, now that I've enabled that API, I can see that there is already a default virtual private cloud. And since I'm within a new project that I just created, I'm okay with using the default. You would want to create a private cloud just for your project. But in this case, I'm okay with just using the default. The next step would be to create the Postgres instance. And this Postgres instance is so that it can be used for persistence in your application, whether it's long-term or short-term. So within your LangGraph application, you have your short-term memory, or your checkpoints, right? It documents your messages. And then you have your long-term memory. So if you want to store things like in a store for long-term memory, then you can also save that in Postgres. Because the way your LangGraph application works is it creates this LangGraph server, and within the server, what you have is your HTTP worker, and that receives, for any request that you submit into the LangGraph application, it receives it and it passes it on to the queue worker. And once it passes it on, it just checks, okay, you received it, okay, my job is done, and it responds to the client to let the client know, okay, that submission was successful. And in the meantime, the queue worker gets to work on creating the task. So what it does is it creates a run ID for that message that you submitted. It saves that run ID into Postgres, or rather it's the HTTP worker that creates the run ID and in the Postgres instance. And then you have your queue worker that's looking for any new creations of runs in that Postgres instance. And then once it sees that there's a new submission, then it can create the task for responding to the request that came in. So it starts processing in the queue worker. The LangGraph server starts processing the request. It runs the agent workflow that you have defined, and then it publishes any updates into the Redis instance. And the Redis instance is really just acting as like a message broker. So as it receives updates from the LangGraph application, it'll broadcast those out to any clients that are listening. In this case, it's the HTTP worker. And so as the HTTP worker receives those updates from the Redis instance, then the HTTP worker starts sending those out into the client. And the reason it's done this way through the Redis instance, instead of just directly from the HTTP worker, is for scalability. Because as your application grows, you don't want to connect your queue worker directly to your HTTP worker, because then you can have many-to-many connections that you would have to manage. And the Redis message broker makes it easy to scale. As you're receiving more streams, then it can broadcast those streams to different clients. And in this case, it's just the HTTP worker. But you can imagine that as your application grows, you can scale this separately. So this is the LangGraph server. You can scale it separately from the Redis instance, which can be scaled on its own as well. So you can add more replicas of your Redis instance so that it can manage all of these incoming updates. And then if there aren't a ton of updates that are coming from your LangGraph, then you can scale this service down. So let's go ahead and create that Postgres instance. And for that, you just go to the Cloud SQL, you can go to create instance, and then you want it to be Postgres, so you choose that. So this is just a development demo. So I'm just gonna go with the most basic options. I'm gonna leave most of these things by default unless you have any specific requirements. I'm just gonna give it the ID of LangGraph Task Agent, and then I'm gonna create a password for it. And then I'm just gonna create a password using a mnemonic with characters, with letters and numbers. Just make sure you save that password somewhere securely. So I'm just gonna save these in this file here, and I'll later delete it. I'm just setting up the Postgres instance right now. And the region, I'm just gonna leave it by default, and I'm just gonna leave it for a single zone. Okay, I'm okay with everything else. I'm not gonna really customize anything. I can see that my instance is gonna cost me 60 cents per hour. I'm okay with that. I'll go ahead and create it. Just make sure that if you're not gonna be using this instance a lot, make sure you delete them from your account, because otherwise you're gonna be billed, 60 cents an hour. Isn't a lot, but over time it does add up. So it's creating the Postgres instance. Now I can move on to the next part. So while our Postgres instance is being created, we can move on to the next part, which would be to create the Redis instance. So I'm just going to type Redis here, and it's going to use Memorystore for Redis as the service. I need to enable the Google Cloud Memorystore for Redis API within this project. Once I'm in the Memorystore, then I can create an instance, and this is just a demo, so I just want to create a single instance and not a cluster. I'm just going to name the ID and the display name the same thing as before. And then for tier, I just want to go with basic, because right now my cost is really high. So I want to bring down the capacity as low as I can. I'll leave everything else the same. The region, I can't change the read replicas. And for the connection, remember we have the default network. If I created my own, then I would just select that one, but I'm just going to use the default virtual private cloud that I have. I'm not going to change anything else. So I am ready to create the instance, and it's going to start creating it now. It might take a few minutes. Okay, before I continue, I want to make sure that my Postgres instance is accessible from my network that I created earlier. So I just navigate into my Postgres instance, and then I go to edit. And then I could do this when I'm creating the instance. I just forgot that I go to connections, and then I don't want to allow public IP. I just want the private IP, and then I select the network that I created earlier. So I set up the connection, and then if you don't have this API enabled, enable service networking API, just click a button that it'll ask you to enable it. And then I'm okay with the default settings. So I'll just click continue, and it's saying, okay, it's going to be using the default network, and I create the connection. Okay, it looks like it created a network connection, and I just have to click save to save my changes. So it's just editing the Postgres instance now. And then I want to make sure that my Redis instance is also connected to that network. I did select it when I was creating it. It looks like it did finish creating that Redis instance, but now I just want to confirm that. So if I'm in my Redis instance, then I can see that the authorized network is the default one, so that's good. Okay, now that my Postgres and Redis instances are created and they're connected to that network, that I created up here in the first step. Then now I can create the service that's going to be hosting my LangGraph application. And for this, I'm going to be using Cloud Run. So I'm going to create a Cloud Build YAML file. And in that file, I'm going to define all of the requirements that I'm going to need in order to deploy this Cloud Run instance. So I provided this Cloud Build example file along with the steps that you're going to need. So the first step would be to create a Python instance. And for that, the reason you want to do that is so that you can automatically generate that Docker file. Because when you're running the LangGraph command line interface, remember from the beginning of this video, that's the tool that's going to create the Docker file, because we don't have a Docker file right now. So I create this image using Python, and then I install the LangGraph command line interface. Once it's installed, then I can run this application that I defined earlier, where I'm using the LangGraph command line interface to create a Docker file, and then I define the path to the configuration for my LangGraph application, which is just going to be the root path in my project here. So I have the project open, and you can see that I have the LangGraph right here, this LangGraph JSON file. So that's what I'm referencing here. And then I just want to name it a Docker file. This is the path to the safe path, right? Where I want to save my Docker file, but in this case, I just want it to be at the root. So this is what I'm naming it, but you could define it to however you want. You could path to Docker file and then, however you need, but I'm just going to leave it as is. And then the next step would be, because I've created this Docker file, now I can build the image. And for that, I'm going to build the image in Google's Artifact Registry. And here's the path for that image. It's going to be inside of my Google Cloud account, right? And this is the repo name. So if you don't already have it created, I need to go create it right now. So I'm going to go back to the Google Cloud console, and then it's the Artifact Registry. And I'm going to create a repository. Once I'm in there, I'm just going to name it LangGraph Task Agent. It's going to host Docker files. Everything I'm just going to leave as the default. You're just going to leave everything has been US Central. And then I'm just going to provide a quick description, although I'll delete this project. This hosts my, I can't type today, LangGraph demo application. Docker images of my LangGraph demo application. Everything is going to be left as default. Okay, I'm ready to create it. So that'll create that repo. So I named it LangGraph Task Agent because that's what I defined here in the repo name. And then the name of the image is just going to be this Task Maestro demo app. And then here it's just saying, give it the tag, the latest, and then save it in the root directory. So I created the repo. And if I go into it, there's not going to be any images because I haven't run this command yet. So once it builds the image in this step, the next step would be to push that Docker image into this repo, right? So that's what this step takes care of. And now that the Docker image is deployed on my Google Cloud account, then I can run the command as before, like when we were doing it locally, the Cloud Run, this one right here. That's what the last step is. It's basically just running that command within the Google Cloud Platform. And here I'm just saying to deploy this image, which is the same name that I defined up here, right? Here's the path to the image. And then just in the region, I'm just defining the parameters for my Cloud Run instance. And then I'm passing in the environment variables right here directly in this cloud build file, but you wouldn't want to do that in production. I'm just doing this for demonstrations purposes, but the way you do it in Google Cloud Console is you create secrets and you manage those secrets within the Google Cloud Platform, and then you make it so that they're only accessible by your project. There's a lot of settings that you would have to configure in order to make it as secure as possible, but basically you just go into secrets. I think it's the secret manager. Yeah, it's secret manager. You need to enable it. Okay, once it's enabled, you'll get directed to this page, and here's where you would create a secret. And let's just create one just to show you how to do it. Let me just call this the LangChain API key. And then for the value, I want to take the value from, in this case, what I would save in my environment variables, right? So I have this example environment variable file here. So whatever you have in your LangChain API key value, that's what you would paste into here. And then once you've pasted the value up there, then you can just accept. You can configure it however you want, if you want it to have an expiration date, but I'm okay with, I can even add a label to help remind me what this secret belongs to. So like if I have multiple projects, within my account, then I can keep track of things that I delete as I delete services. So I'll just create, let me delete this. I'll create the secret. And then once you've created your secrets, then the way you would provide them to your application would be, it's shown in this documentation here. Basically, you provide them by giving them a version name, and there's this path right here that you would use. But that's beyond the scope of this video. So we're just going to paste the values directly in here. Or actually, I think you can provide them as substitutions if you define them down here. I haven't tried this. It does work for the project ID. I think I ran into some issues with other ones, but if defining it this way as substitutions, if that doesn't work, then just paste the values directly in here. And again, this is just for development purposes, right? Once you're gonna have this in production, even before that, you don't want to save this cloud build YAML file in your GitHub, because it's going to be saved in the Git history. These values are going to be saved in the Git history. So I do recommend that you try to use the secrets as soon as possible, unless you already plan on deleting this Git project and deleting the history. And then lastly, I just define the port where I want to access my application. I don't need it to be authenticated right now, but if you wanted to add authentication, then remove this flag. And then here are just some other configuration settings for my Cloud instance. I just want it to be 2 gigs with two CPUs. And then this last flag is the VPC connector. So Cloud Run is hosting your application serverless, and because your application is not on a server, then you can't connect directly to the network because there's no server to connect to the network. So what you do is, when your Cloud Run instance is running, you would have a VPC connector, and that connector connects to the VPC, the virtual private cloud. And that's how you get around your application being hosted serverless and still being able to connect to that virtual private cloud. So that would be the next step that we would need to do after this. I just want to finish showing you this cloud build file. Here are just some options that I defined for once this application is running. So in order to get this to work, just make sure that you replace these environment variables, and then you've already created the Artifact Registry repo. So once I've made those changes, I'm ready to save this file, the cloud build file. And again, just to summarize, in that cloud build YAML file, what you did is you created the Docker image, and then you saved that Docker image to the Google Artifact Registry. And then you provided the environment variables to your application because you're running that command, from before, this one right here. And so this is where your environment variables are defined. And then lastly, you run the application on your Cloud instance. That's what this cloud build YAML file does. I'm just making some edits to this README file as I'm going through it, but so that it makes more sense when you're reading it. But like I said, Cloud Run is serverless, so we can't connect to the virtual private cloud directly. So we'll use the VPC connector to allow Cloud Run to access the private network where the Postgres instance resides, and also the Redis instance. And this avoids exposing the database directly to the public internet. So we'll proceed with that step, create the virtual private cloud connector. So as I said, the VPC connector allows us to connect the serverless Cloud Run instance to the virtual private cloud. And I provide the link to the documentation on how to do that, but basically here's the command line interface command to create a virtual private cloud connector. I'm just going to open the documentation. So looking into the documentation, here's the full command. And you do need to have the Google Cloud command line tool installed in your terminal. Or you could do it if you wanted to just do it from within the Google Cloud. Then you can go in the top right corner, there should be a console button. This is just going to take me to the Google Cloud console. And then from there, I can go to activate Cloud Shell. And then from the shell, then I can just run the command. If you don't have the gcloud command line tool installed on your local machine, this is how you do it. So it's just provisioning the Cloud Shell machine right now. Okay, so my shell is ready. And what I want to do is copy the command. They provide an example here, but just use the one that I provided in the README file because I set it so that it's using the default network already. And then I'm naming it, the same that I have defined in the cloud build file. So this is the same name, right? The VPC connector, I'm using that in here. So I can run this command in my shell. I'm just going to copy and paste it into here. And I get an error. Okay, the error that I was getting is because I was trying to define the network and the range and also define a subnet. Previously, I had created a subnet, but I don't think I'll need to because it'll create one by default. So I'm just going to change the command a little bit, make sure that it works, and then whatever works is what I'll leave in the documentation. Authorize. Okay, so it's just asking me, it's really small to see, but let me just zoom in. I ran the command and it's telling me that the VPC access Google API is not enabled. Do you want to enable it? So I just click Y for yes. It's enabling the service on my project. Okay, I had to come back to this because it took a little bit longer than expected to run this, but I've created the VPC connector, but actually the first thing I had to create was a subnet. I couldn't use the default one, and it was just easier to create a subnet. Not really sure how these networking things work, but what I had to do was first create the subnet, and here's the command to create it. You're just creating the subnet and then on the default network, and then you have to specify a range with a mask of 28, and then you specify the region. So when I ran that, it gave me these details on the created subnet, and then now I can create the VPC connector that's going to use that subnet. So instead of specifying when you're creating the VPC connector, a few minutes ago, I was trying to create it with a range and a network specified, but instead I'm just going to specify the subnet that I just created in the previous step. So if I run this command, then I get the details that it was created successfully. Let me zoom in. So the connector was created successfully, and I just want to confirm that. So I just run this command that I have here in the documentation to confirm that this connector was created. And if I run it, it gives me the details of my VPC connector. Okay, we're almost done. The last thing I have to do is to create the cloud build trigger. So if I go to cloud build, I just have to enable this API if I haven't already done so. And once I've enabled it, then I can proceed to create a trigger. And this trigger, what it's going to do is anytime that there's an update to the app, it's going to run my cloud build file. So the example here, this is just an example that I'm showing you, but I have a file. And the reason I don't want to bring it up is because I have the environment variables saved directly on the file. So once I set up this trigger, it will run this cloud build file. And I actually just realized that the only way I'm going to get this to work is if I have this already in GitHub. But in order for Cloud Build to listen for these updates, you're going to see that if I try to create it, it's going to ask for where are these updates being posted. And I need to create a repository where I'm going to be storing this repo. So I have to do that on GitHub. So I'm just going to push these updates into the GitHub so that I can connect it here. And I actually just realized that the only way I'm going to get this to work is if these are already in the GitHub. Okay, so I just finished publishing my project to my GitHub repo, and I have it in a different repo just because I want to keep these environment variables secure in the cloud build file that I have here, because I'm going to delete this project after I'm done with it. It's the same project that we've been working with, but I just saved it in its own repo. So all of the files that are saved in here are the same ones that you can find under projects, LangGraph Task Agent. It's just this folder here in its own repo. And now that it's shared on GitHub, then I can create a cloud build trigger to listen to any updates that are posted on here, and then trigger the build for the Cloud Run instance. So if I go into Cloud Build, now I'm ready to set up a build trigger, and I can just call it LangGraph Task Agent. I'll keep it consistent. Global is fine. This is just temporary. So I'm just going to give that description, temporary trigger. And the repository, basically you just have to connect a repository here. You'll click on continue, and then it'll have you log into your GitHub. Mine is already authenticated, so it just automatically did it. And then here you can select the repository that you want to listen for changes in. And if you don't see it listed, then just click on edit repositories on GitHub, and then it'll open up your GitHub account. Let me just make this bigger. And then you can see the repositories that are in your GitHub. And then you can select more from here. Just type in the name of the repository, and then you can click save. So for example, the YouTube one that I have, I could just make this one, and then I can click save, and then it'll be available as a selection here. But since I already have, let's see, I can't select it because I've already connected it. So yeah, I would just select the project, right? And then just approve this and then click connect. But mine is already connected because I did it right before resuming the recording. You can see it's listening for changes at the LangGraph Task Agent repo. And then for configuration, I just click on Cloud Build because that's what we're using. And it's available at the root directory. You can see it's right here. Everything else looks fine. Service account, I think that's important. You do need one, so I'm just going to select the default one. It does give you a warning that this one has a lot of access to things, so you would want to create your own service account, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So I'll click create to create the trigger, and now it's ready to run. So if I were to make a change here, it would actually be in this project because this is the one that it's listening for. If I were to make any changes on here and then I push them into GitHub, then it'll automatically trigger this build, but I don't have any changes to make. So I'll just manually click run trigger so that it starts to build. And then it says it failed. Okay, so it failed because I was actually testing some stuff out. But let me just revert those changes. Okay, so that issue was because of how I have the environment variables down here. And so what I would just do is put the values in here instead, then use the substitutions, and then make your changes. I'm going to commit these changes, and then I'm going to make a push to my GitHub. So those updates are pushed. Now I should see this automatically trigger cloud build. If I go into the history, okay, so it did trigger a build. These are just some tests that I was running. It looks like it has started building, and it should take like no more than 5 minutes to finish. In the meantime, while that's continuing to build, I had some things I wanted to go over. So if you go into your Redis, then scroll under till you see connections. This primary endpoint, this is the endpoint that you're going to use to connect to your Redis. So that would be substituted into the Redis URI right here. So you just replace this here with the endpoint from your primary endpoint here. And the default port is fine, 6379. And then for your Postgres, when we created the Postgres instance, we created it with Postgres as the username as well as the database name. And then the password, remember we created it with this password here when we created the Postgres instance. So I just post that password in here. And then for my Postgres network internal IP address, you just go into your Postgres instance, you scroll down until you see the connect to this instance, And then under VPC network, you go to internal IP address, you copy that, and then you paste it into here. And then the port is 5432 as it says right there. So just paste that in there. And yeah, just make sure you replace your password here. So in my case, this is the password I used to create it. So that's my URI to connect to my Redis and my Postgres. And then another thing is that I actually had the name wrong in the artifact registry. So I just updated it here. I'm updating this documentation, so you shouldn't see this issue if you're following along with mine. But just make sure that this repo name is the same repo name that you have in your artifact registry, so that when it's trying to build that Docker image and also push the image into the artifact registry, then it's pushing it to the right repo that we created earlier. And then lastly, I have this allow unauthenticated flag for when it creates my Cloud Run instance. So I should be able to access my endpoint without being authenticated. But for some reason, I was getting a 403 when I tried to go to my endpoint. So all you have to do is go to your Cloud Run instance, click on it, and then go to security, and then just make sure that allow unauthenticated invocations is selected. It'll give you a warning, but you know, this is just a demo, so configure it however you need for your security for in production. Let me just update this here. So again, yeah, just make sure you replace the values in here. If you're doing it this way, I don't recommend it. I recommend that you do go with using Google secret keys. Okay, so let's check on the build. It looks like it finished. So that means that my Cloud Run instance should be running. So if I just copy that, open a new tab, telling me not found because there's no response for the plain endpoint. But if I go to docs, that's where my docs are stored, right? And then in order to interact with my application through the studio, then I can just go to LangSmith and then go to LangGraph Platform. On the top right here, you might not be able to see it with me in the way, but in the top right, you should see an Open Studio button. Next to it, there's a drop down. And then in the drop down, you just paste the link to wherever your endpoint is and you click connect. And then that will pull up the application. You can test it by typing a message. Hello world. Okay, and the AI did respond. Okay, so we successfully deployed our LangGraph application on Google Cloud Platform. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like, write a comment. It really does help get this video out there to more people, and then it's going to motivate me to create more videos like this. Hope to see you on the next one.